Hi everybody. Welcome to Asynchronous and Synchronous Hybrid Teaching Techniques. My name is Colin Walker. I'm serving as an interim training specialist for the Center for Excellence in Learning and Teaching and eLearning. I'm also an assistant professor in the mass media program here at Valdosta State University. And here are our learning outcomes for today. By the end of the webinar, you will be able to describe the benefits and challenges associated with synchronous and asynchronous teaching techniques, distinguish which asynchronous or synchronous teaching technique is best for a given learning outcome or activity, demonstrate best practices associated with asynchronous and synchronous teaching environments, and finally, design a flexible hybrid course to support your students. For this webinar, you will need a few resources. So first, you'll need a desktop or laptop computer. Second, you will need a working internet connection. And third, you will need access to Blackboard Collaborate Ultra or Microsoft Teams. Keep in mind that eLearning help is available for Blackboard Collaborate Ultra, and IT supports Microsoft Teams. I recommend having one of those two platforms open so that you can think about how you would apply principles that we are speaking about today in your own classes. So why do we teach and learn asynchronously and synchronously? So I wanted to start off this slide with a quote from Gardner from this year. One of the most important steps educators can take, and one that can alleviate some anxiety and frustration, is determining what content should be delivered to students synchronously, whether that be in live or in real time, and what learning can be supported asynchronously, recorded or self-paced. So, one thing to think about is that when online education first began and online courses were initially offered, they were almost totally asynchronous. Two main reasons for this were they were designed for adult learners who had full-time jobs and couldn't attend the face-to-face class sessions. And at the same time, there weren't as many tools available for synchronous learning as we have right now. So this is a dilemma that most of us faculty members are facing this fall with which elements to have asynchronous versus synchronous. So one of the main reasons we need to think about this is because we might need to pivot quickly to fully online instruction this fall. It could happen sooner rather than later, but we will wait and see what occurs. Next, we want to provide a variety in our course design, and we need to engage our students in multiple modalities. You won't be able to just do everything synchronously or everything asynchronously. We're going to need to be flexible for our students because they're facing life just the way we are too. And finally, adapting to student work schedules and off-campus life situations. As many of us say, life happens, and those are the times where we try to work with our students as best as we can. So before we get into the heart of today's discussion, let's do an activity. So first, I would like you to get a sheet of paper or open up a blank Word document. Next, please number 1 through 5 in the left-hand column. And now for 5 minutes, I would like you to write or type 5 facts that you think you already know about the webinar topic of asynchronous and synchronous hybrid teaching techniques. Just brainstorm, please don't look ahead. When you're done predicting what you think you already know, continue the webinar to learn if you're right and see what you didn't know. So now we're going to tackle asynchronous teaching techniques. So now we'll start off with a working baseline definition of asynchronous. This definition was provided by Maria Fainol. Asynchronous learning is a student-centered teaching method widely used in online learning. Its basic premise is that learning can occur in different times and spaces particular to each learner, as opposed to synchronous learning at a same time and place with groups of learners and their instructor, or one learner and their instructor. In asynchronous learning, instructors usually set up a learning path which students engage with at their own pace. It's important to start off with a working definition of asynchronous so we can have a more constructive discussion about when and why we should use asynchronous techniques in our own teaching. So first, it's difficult maintaining schedules. This is where asynchronous learning can come in handy. You may not always be able to meet one-on-one with students. They might not be able to attend all the live lectures. You may need to actually miss a class session as well as an instructor. So this builds in some flexibility. It also promotes peer-to-peer or group work among students outside of the classroom. So there's a lot of different ways that you can work with your students in the asynchronous environment by equipping them with certain tools to make that happen. It also lets you assist students with different levels of access to resources. For example, if a student is having a problem with their internet connection during a specific part of the day, they may need to view a class session later on in the day. Maybe an emergency came up. That's another way that you could assist your students as well. And remember, you all as instructors, life happens to us too. So we may not have resources during specific times of the day and may need to deliver the content to our students asynchronously in specific circumstances. So why should we use asynchronous techniques? First, it allows more student voices to be heard in many instances, with the goal that all student voices are heard through the use of specific tools. One example of an asynchronous tool that you might want to try out is VoiceThread. If you'd like more information on VoiceThread, go to the BlazeView 101 course that you are all registered for inside of BlazeView. Next, it gives us instructors more control over the structure of the content. In some instances, it can allow us to chunk and focus on specific important aspects of content, depending on how we structure the content in that asynchronous manner using tools like BlazeView. Next, it can provide opportunities for more interaction among students. So you could use things like discussion boards. You could maybe have students post videos, use Web 2.0 tools like Flipgrid. And these are all tools we're discussing in other trainings for this fall semester for all of the faculty. It allows students to also work at their own pace somewhat too. Depending on how you set your deadlines, you can make it where students can maybe work around their schedules when it becomes necessary to do so. You can also facilitate group work outside of class meetings using tools in BlazeView like groups. You could actually open up channels in a tool like Microsoft Teams. You could also have chat rooms that are dedicated to specific groups inside of Blackboard Collaborate Ultra. There's a lot of possibilities here. It helps you also get buy-in from your less social students too. Not all students are as comfortable interacting in a synchronous class session. It also helps with avoiding dealing with scheduling issues and live distractions that might happen. So you might have someone building a building next to you and have construction going on, and it may not be easy to teach synchronously at that point in time because you have so much loud noise near you. Okay, so this is where asynchronous is extremely helpful. You can also address alternate forms of delivery for learning and other accessibility related issues as well. And I would recommend contacting the VSU Access Office for tips on how to do this. It also makes it so that we as instructors can have less concern for time-sensitive technological glitches. For example, the internet, it goes out. Your Wi-Fi might go out. Your computer may just decide to update at a very random time. You don't want to have it where your students have lost out on the ability to learn because of something happened that may have been beyond them. I'm sure all of you have had this happen to you too. So there's so many possibilities and reasons why we should try using asynchronous teaching techniques in our courses. So now let's speak about some best practices for teaching in the asynchronous environment. First, make sure to communicate often and be clear. Communicating often might mean that you make sure that you communicate with your students, let's say 2 to 3 times a week if it's a fully online course. You want to have multiple touch points to make sure the students know that you're there and you're engaged with their learning. In addition, you need to make sure to be clear about your messages. You may need to script out certain items, especially when you're teaching asynchronously and recording certain items. This is where, if you go off on tangents, it may become unclear what the initial message was supposed to be for the student. Next, demonstrate empathy. This is where show your students that you care about them. Show them that, hey, they're not alone. Okay? So, for example, this summer I was teaching a course where one of the faculty members involved was saying how they would record some of their weekly updates in random locations that they had traveled to while going camping. That was just a way to show them that, hey, we as faculty member, we're real people too. We're not just stuck in some office all the time. Next, work on creating participatory learning communities. And this is where communication, again, is very important. You need to engage your students. Try to use active learning techniques, which we're speaking about a lot in these different teaching sessions for you all this fall. I also recommend take some time and teach your students about the course tools at the start of the course. It doesn't matter if the student is a freshman, a senior, or a graduate student. Don't just assume that your students understand how to use each one of these tools. Remember, every teacher teaches a little bit differently, so they may use tools in different manners. This is where we can communicate our expectations to our students. And I believe that is going to be extremely important, especially this semester, with the possibility of having to quickly pivot to online being on the horizon, as was stated earlier. And finally, make sure to work on your structure and your organization. Make sure it is very clear where to get certain things in the course. For example, make sure there's a clear destination where maybe quizzes are, or homework assignments, or online recordings, or the location of where to go for synchronous class sessions. You want to make sure all these items are clear for your students because first, it makes it easier for them, but second, you're going to find you probably won't get as many emails of students being confused at the start of the semester. One tip I would recommend is maybe record a video showing how to navigate through the course and maybe have just a short assessment on that to make sure that students saw the video and provide them an opportunity to ask you questions. Now let's speak about how to apply some of those asynchronous best practices that we just discussed. So first, Make sure to post announcements often, but be strategic about it. Make sure to post announcements a few days before significant assignments are due. This can be done through scheduling some of the announcements. Next, you may want to promote feedback. If you're trying to get your students to respond to something, make sure to be clear about how you want them to communicate with you. Is it through the BlazeU email system? Is it a specific discussion board? Or do you prefer that they use their @valdosta.edu accounts? Next, make sure to humanize the course and support your students. If you know of resources, or maybe just discover resources that may assist your students on a particular assignment, it's good to post them in this type of announcement. Consider posting videos or other audio content to humanize the course and just be able to show the students your face. That helps them kind of know that they're not alone in their learning in the course. And when you do that, try to outline some bullet points or even fully script what you're trying to say. Next, make your content online and the assessments count. Go for quality over quantity. This is where you don't want your students to think that they're just completing assignments just for the sake of doing assignments. Okay, do your best to make sure that each assessment also aligns with a particular course learning outcome. Or in some instances, you may be just trying to align them with module learning outcomes, which also then map back to your course learning outcomes. And finally, make sure to check for accessibility. In some instances, it may be easier to post PDF documents that can be read via screen readers for students who require such access. Next, make sure to engage students using the tools inside of BlazeU, Microsoft Teams, or using other multimedia, such as Kaltura with video, VoiceThread. Maybe you narrate some PowerPoint slides. You could have interactive polls for your students. There's a lot of different ways to engage them. Find out what's of interest of them, and then work on using those tools if possible. And finally, be consistent in your structure and your organization. This will help provide your students with a clear path for how to find assignments and other resources in your course. If you make a mistake, make sure to admit it to your students. One thing that I recommend doing is go to the student view when you are building your course just to double check that every link lines up. You don't want to have an email at midnight when an assignment is due saying that the instructions for the assignment just were not there. So just go back and double check this. And finally, make sure to just check everything in draft mode before you publish it to your students, just so you get the best presentation possible out to your students. Next, we are going to speak about synchronous teaching techniques along with best practices. And now I'd like to go back to Maria Fainol for looking at synchronous learning and providing a working definition for today's webinar. Synchronous learning refers to all types of learning in which learners and instructors are in the same place at the same time in order for learning to take place. This includes in-person classes, live online meetings, when the whole class or small groups get together. In synchronous learning, students usually go through the learning path together, accompanied by their instructor who's able to provide support while students are completing tasks and activities. Before we dive further into synchronous learning, we are going to do an active learning activity. So what I would like you to do right now is take 5 minutes and draft an announcement for one of your BlazeU shells that introduces your students to the hybrid design of your course. Specifically, explain when and why you will use asynchronous and synchronous teaching techniques. When you finish doing this, feel free to move ahead. So now let's discuss when and why we should use synchronous techniques. So first, this is a good time to clarify difficult concepts. It's good to have your students there with you so that you can basically provide them with feedback on questions they might have or help them get over certain obstacles that maybe they've sent you messages about regarding a particular assignment or just certain content in your course. Also, you could run study sessions and hold office hours using synchronous techniques, whether they be online or face-to-face. It's also a good time to introduce assignments to make sure it is clear what your intention is for the assignment and what you would like the students to do to complete that assignment. You can also facilitate group collaboration and have active learning activities that you schedule for those sessions. That helps make certain to the students that their time is valuable, that you want them to be there synchronously with you at a specific time and in a specific place. It also helps provide that feeling of connectedness and having a real-time interaction. I'm sure many of you have learned from teaching the spring and just from these summer months that connectedness and just having real-time interactions with one another, whether it be your students or just with family members or friends, it's extremely important to each one of us. So now let's speak about best practices for applying these synchronous teaching techniques. So first off, for video conferencing, the two platforms that are supported by Valdosta State University are Blackboard Collaborate Ultra or Microsoft Teams. eLearning is available for support for Collaborate Ultra. The Division of Information Technology, which you all know as IT, is supportive of Microsoft Teams. So please make sure to contact one or the other when it comes to support for each one of those systems. So in terms of synchronous learning, a good habit to get into is to divide your content up into 10-minute chunks. This helps you have the opportunity to emphasize specific content and to make sure the students are engaged during these time periods. This is a way to structure your teaching, but also structure the students' learning at the same time. Again, quality over quantity. You don't need to record really long sessions. You do not necessarily have to meet with small groups for an hour at a time. If they're very focused meetings, they might only be 10 to 15 minutes in duration. You also want to balance out the class time for full class discussion and breakout groups. So this is where in some instances you may have your students working in groups on the same assignment, but you may take time to go in and speak with each one of those individual groups without speaking to the class as a whole, whether this be online or face-to-face. You can also have a course closing celebration or final student presentations occurring in an online classroom as well. So you don't have to lose what you maybe have done in a face-to-face class. I also recommend potentially training your students on tools in the synchronous environment. In some instances, it can be okay to have tutorials that your students view asynchronously, but sometimes students do need to ask questions, so it's sometimes good to have a follow-up training session in a synchronous learning environment. Now I would like you to take the next 5 minutes and look back at the draft announcement that you wrote earlier for Blazeview. Please refine the announcement based on what you have learned in the webinar since then. Once you have finished, please move ahead. I'm going to bet that some of you, after completing that activity, have realized that it shouldn't be an either-or approach when it comes to asynchronous and synchronous learning. In other words, both approaches should be used. Pedagogical research now shows faculty should use both asynchronous and synchronous teaching techniques. This is a departure from when online education first began and only included asynchronous teaching and learning. Since asynchronous and synchronous is not really an either-or approach, we really need to speak about which teaching techniques works best for a particular learning outcome or activity. It's important that your choice is always aligned with your active learning activity. So, for example, in the synchronous learning environment, it could be clarification, community building, or any other sort of group work. As we said earlier, you may be wanting to address difficult concepts that the students are running into, or provide problem-solving situations for your students. At the same time, though, remember there are some challenges with synchronous learning. There could be tech-related issues. Sometimes it's not as flexible if students are having to deal with some outside of school type issues. Okay. With synchronous, some of the tools that you can use are going to be Blackboard Collaborate Ultra, Microsoft Teams, or even Microsoft Forms. In the asynchronous environment, this is a lot of times where training on software can come into account through tutorials. You may be looking at assessing student knowledge. You may have short lectures on topics or provide opportunities for students to analyze certain information. There's also challenges here. You may have the lack of face-to-face contact, which can take away from the feeling of connectedness for the students. And also, this is where miscommunication can occur. So it's very important to get feedback early and often from your students to prevent such miscommunication in the future. Some of the asynchronous tools you can use are BlazeU discussion boards, BlazeU quizzes, Kaltura videos, or even Kaltura video quizzes, VoiceThread, and then also Teams can be used in a way with delivering some asynchronous items as well. Throughout this webinar, we have spoken about the importance of communication in multiple instances. So here, I just want you to consider potentially crowdsourcing communication guidelines for asynchronous and synchronous learning. These are just some examples. So first, you may tell your students they must be prepared for each synchronous video conferencing session and have their equipment properly set up beforehand. Have the students remain open-minded and share their own ideas as well as listen to their peers speak about themselves and their work. Make sure to remind students, take the time to think before responding in writing or even aloud to their fellow peers. Make sure to be responsive and communicative to the professor and their peers in email, asynchronous discussions, and synchronous discussions. Be open to feedback for both the professor and the peers. And don't assume that all feedback is negative. Try to first assume that it's positive, supportive. And finally, be honest and respectful while interacting asynchronously and synchronously for class. This can be a crowdsourced set of guidelines that's created with you and your students. This helps them get a sense of buy-in and agency for the course. So while we ask our students to be respectful of each other, we also need to be able to support them as well. To support our students, it's important that we build a flexible course design. So first, make sure, plan a path for your students. Make sure it's clear how they should navigate the course. Next, explain the purpose of each one of your assignments. And do the best to align these with learning outcomes or even possible future career paths for your students. Lead the students by example by being active in the course, whether it be in a synchronous or asynchronous manner. Provide flexibility for students to make their own learning space when possible. This is where sometimes you can crowdsource some ideas with your students. Admit when you make mistakes and understand that life happens. It happens to the students, but it also happens to us, so it's important to build that trust. And finally, offer tips and suggestions for working past technology-related hurdles that occur, as I'm going to show you a few suggestions on this next slide. So here's a list of suggestions related to technology. Recommend that your students turn on their video while speaking to engage with their peers and with the instructor. This can kind of help build that feeling of connectedness. Be careful though, because if somebody has poor internet service, then they might not be able to display video without a significant lag occurring. There may be some students who also don't want to show where they live for privacy-based reasons. So you may want to speak with your students about this at the outset of the course. Don't rely on random grouping functions inside of any tool. To be honest, it's not that random. And then finally, when it comes to getting support for the online learning platforms, please make sure to contact the correct personnel. For BlazeView, Blackboard Collaborate Ultra, Kaltura, and VoiceThread, eLearning is going to be the place to contact. For help with Microsoft Teams, please contact the IT department. I hope each one of you have learned a lot from this webinar. As you will see here are a list of references for information that was used in today's presentation for those of you who would like to explore more items related to asynchronous and synchronous learning. Take care.